Good afternoon and welcome, everybody. It's great to see so many people here for this kickoff event of our Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination. My name is 𝙎𝙬𝙪𝙨, and I currently serve as Chief of Staff in the President's Office and a Professor of Psychology. It's been a real privilege over the last several years since the beginning of the strategic plan to help lead and craft this process which has led to this day. I'd like to thank many people that contributed to this process, particularly Father Alan Deck, who co-chaired with me the organizing committee for this new academy, this Center of Excellence at Loyola Marymount University, and all the faculty who served on that organizing committee. And since it was announced by the President last spring, the advisory board for the Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination. For those people who have served on one of those two committees, will you please stand? And let's get... This is really only the beginning, but it's taken a lot of work to get to the beginning. Recently in a homily, Pope Francis said, "This is the important thing, to get to know people, to listen, to expand the circle of ideas." He went on to say that the world is crisscrossed with roads that come closer together and then farther apart. But the important thing is that they always lead towards the good. I think that's beautifully put. And as we launch this new academy, we have a well thought out, much battled over many intense meetings, well parsed mission statement. You can see it there. But in many ways, Francis summed it up. What the Academy represents for LMU and beyond is really a chance to get to know people, to listen, and to expand the circle of ideas. It's a place where the crisscross roads of our lives and our scholarship can move closer together and then further apart, where praxis and thinking, scholarship and engagement can always lead us forward towards the good. It is our hope that the Academy will serve this purpose and will amplify the intellectual and imaginative traditions in Catholic history, that it will reflect critically on their message and their importance for current pressing issues in our society, and that it will contribute to recreating these traditions anew for the 21st century, by utilizing the intellectual skills and methods from scholars from every discipline imaginable and every perspective imaginable. The person behind this vision, from the beginning, the one who imagined it into being in his inaugural address as president, is our president. And so I give you the 15th president of Loyola Marymount University, David W. 𝙬𝙗.
Thank you, Joe, and let me echo his sentiment. It's so wonderful to see such a diverse, large group of people here for this event. Faculty and staff, a lot of faculty, students, alums, benefactors, trustees. It's a great group. Thank you for attending. Joe is right. When I gave my inaugural address at the beginning, in the first year of my presidency, I sort of emphasized three main themes that would drive us, that would inform our decision making, that would, both in terms of how we allocate our resources and how we structure ourselves internally within the university. Three major themes. One was the pursuit of academic excellence. One was the continuing enhancement and advancement of our Catholic, Jesuit, Marymount traditions and mission. And one was the wise stewardship and expenditures and allocation of our limited resources. An important point that I think I made with respect to academic excellence in our mission is that we often speak of them disjunctively, as though they were separate initiatives, separate themes on separate tracks. But the more I've been at LMU and the more I've learned from our students and especially our faculty and staff, the more I realize that it's a mistake to keep these two important, the essence of our core, if you will, these two important themes separate. That academic excellence is part and parcel to the pursuit of our Ignatian mission and vice versa. And so as you look around our campus, as I've had now the opportunity to do for a number of years, our Catholicity is palpable, whether it's because of the symbolic features of our architecture, our chapel in particular, whether it's our structures in campus ministry and the other areas in which we serve faculty and staff in their, as they are on their spiritual journeys, is palpable. But the one thing, and certainly in our student organizations that emphasize service of others as an important part of an undergraduate education. But it is absolutely the case that in the academic arena, we need to do more to show, to demonstrate that our Catholic and Ignatian mission and traditions are walking hand in hand, if not this, or actually the same goals as in our academic program. Hence, this academy. This academy is located squarely in our the academic side of the house. The director will report to the provost. The academy will be active in all of our colleges and schools, not just in one, not located in one. And as Joe mentioned, the intent is to provide a rich forum and opportunity for interdisciplinary research, working with students, working with faculty, as we move forward and become more versed in and conversant in this rich intellectual tradition, as well as we use it to address some of the perplexing issues in our community, in our university community, as well as in the larger community. And so it worked its way into our strategic plan. A lot of people think that strategic plans get dust on the shelf. Hasn't been the case. If you read the first action item, as I'm sure you all have, in Section 5, Theme 5 of our strategic plan, you will see that we will establish a center that explores this rich Catholic intellectual tradition, and today we can check that off. The hard work is yet to come. The hard work is to make it into the success that I know it will be, but we have done the legwork to establish it. I want to thank in particular Joe 𝙅𝙬 and Father Deck for spearheading the mission and to bring this to fruition. And there's lots and lots of other people that also, that Joe mentioned, that are responsible, but now it's up to each of us. The responsibility for the success is not located in a particular office, in a particular director, or a particular committee. It is to the community of LMU to make this work. So I thank you very much, and I now will have Joe 𝙬𝙬 introduce our keynote speaker. Thank you.
So we're delighted with this crowd. There are many people upstairs as well in the overflow room in 300. If any of you on the sides want to go up there, you can, but I hope you stay here because it's great to have all this energy in this room. And we're really delighted to have our keynote speaker today. Our keynote speaker Brother Guy Consolmagno is the president of the Vatican Observatory Foundation, and he's the recipient of the 2014 Carl Sagan Award, or Medal, from the American Astronomical Society for translating science into broad concepts that can be understood by the rest of us. Brother Guy is a Jesuit brother, astronomer, meteoricist, and the author of a number of popular books, including Turn Left at Orion and Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? We maybe can ask him about that in the question and answer session afterwards. After earning his undergraduate and master's degrees at MIT, he received a PhD in planetary science from the University of Arizona. Brother Guy is an active scientist and a prolific researcher who has over 200 scientific publications, exploring the connections between meteorites, asteroids, and the evolution of small solar system bodies. He works in both Arizona at the observatory that's connected to the University of Arizona, that's the part of the Vatican Observatory, and also at Castel Gandolfo, the Vatican Observatory in Italy. There in Italy, he curates the Vatican's meteorite collection and measures the physical properties of meteorites. According to his citation when he received the Carl Sagan Medal this past summer, Brother Guy has a decades-long track record of communicating planetary science to the public while maintaining an active scientific career. He is known in his field as well for being a credible spokesperson for scientific honesty within the context of religious belief. And perhaps most interestingly of all, his name was immortalized recently when the Small Bodies Nomenclature Committee of the International Astronomical Union named an asteroid after him. Asteroid 4597, Consolmagno. His presentation today is entitled Science, Religion, and the Art of Storytelling. Please welcome Brother Guy Consolmagno.
Thank you very much. Thank you. The story starts in 1970. I was a college freshman then. I was a liberal arts major at Boston College. And I was taking a creative writing class, and my creative writing teacher said to me, if you want to know how to be a good writer, read good writing. So he assigned us to read the Narnia books by C.S. Lewis. I'd never heard of them. But my best friend from high school was going to MIT, which is just up the road from Boston College, and MIT has something called the MIT Science Fiction Society, and they have the largest collection of fantasy and science fiction. He said, hey, we can go there and borrow the copy of the books from there. Now, the interesting thing is when I was a kid, I was not one who was much to read fantasy. I wanted books with facts, just kind of like Eustace in these books, if you've ever read them. So I discovered Narnia at the age of 18. And I was concentrating, reading the books, I was concentrating on the author's technique. So I was completely unprepared for what actually happened to me when I was reading these books. It wasn't the fact that they're overtly Christian. I was a practicing Catholic then, that was nothing new. Nor was I surprised to see that, hey, I was captured by the adventures. That's supposed to happen when you read an adventure book. But the confluence of the two threads did something very world-shifting to me. They showed me that my Christian faith was itself an adventure as exciting as any fantasy story. And in the process, they showed me that fantasy is, in fact, true. Another thing that happened was I got to meet the MIT Science Fiction Society. When I set eyes on that library, the world's largest collection, open shelf collection of science fiction, I immediately forgot about Boston College, and I conspired to get myself into MIT. I wound up changing colleges, changing majors, ultimately changing vocations, so I could read about adventures on other planets. Ultimately, I wound up writing not the adventures, but about the planets themselves. So, what do I actually ask for when I'm reading a story? All I ask for are three things. First of all, make me turn the pages. Secondly, show me something I haven't seen before. And third, be honest. Easy, right? Yeah, sure. Actually, they're exactly the same things I look for when I'm reading a scientific paper or when I'm trying to write one. And they also are the three ways that science fiction or science brings me close to God. First of all, like the Narnia books, there has to be this underlying sense of joy. Even if the story is a tragedy, it's that sense of joy, it's that sense of wonder that gets you to turn the pages. That sense of joy, as C.S. Lewis himself points out, is, in fact, a touchstone of the presence of God. It works the same way in science. The work has to be interesting. And what makes the work interesting? We'll get to that. Point two, show me something I haven't seen before. You know, novelty is essential. Without it, there's no novel. And of course, in science, the worst crime you can make is to publish work that's already been published. But in both cases, you discover that the real trick is to show the unexpected hidden in the ordinary, because that's also how we find God in this world. Finally, we recognize God when we recognize that the story is true, or when we recognize science is true, because truth is the sign of God's presence. God is truth. What makes up a true story? An honest story is one where the characters are believable, the action makes sense. The action may be surprising, but then after you read it, you go, yeah, that's right. I didn't see it coming, but that's what really would have happened. You got it. It's not necessarily people who I actually like. It's not necessarily people who I actually agree with. Indeed, real life means people we love doing things we wish they didn't do. If we didn't love them, we wouldn't care about what they did. But the point is, in a story, you know that a story that just pushes its characters around in order to make some point is a dreadful story. But a story that shows reasonable outcomes to understandable, if sometimes regrettable, decisions by the characters, that's a story that allows me to evaluate the implications of those decisions, to evaluate what were the philosophical assumptions. Where were these characters coming from? What were they thinking? And when you learn to do that in a story with a character in a story, you learn to do that with the people you meet in real life. Scholars have long recognized the power of stories to teach us. After all, Jesus taught with parables. Our philosophy, our ethics, ultimately our religion exists in a lived context, which means story, which means narrative. In her recent book, Prophets of the Posthuman, Christina Bieber-Lake argues that stories point to us the kinds of selves we can be, and they help us determine the ethical appropriateness of our actions. For example, consider a hot issue in ethics right now, the issue of the ethical implications of biotechnology. Now, it happens that in the Miles Verkostegin science fiction series by Lois McMaster-Bujold, we're actually shown a number of different effects, good and bad, that come from having uterine replicators that would allow an embryo to grow completely to birth within an artificial womb so the mom can go off and do something else. She also shows some startling implications of human cloning and the genetic enhancement of human embryos. Now, as it happens, the philosopher Christopher Kotzker, in a recent book, The Defense of Dignity, discusses exactly these same topics. And he does it with great erudition, and he's actually a pretty good writer. But the ideas don't come alive on his page the way they do in Bujold's books. The science fiction novels give you a context to those ideas. As story, they're centered around people that I can believe really would act the way that we see them act, given the circumstances that they're in. And they're fun to read. Now, let's be clear. The Bujold books are not philosophy, they're space opera. They make no pretense to high literature. The covers are garish, the plots are full of all sorts of daring-do. They are designed, first and foremost, to be page-turners. They follow the adventures of a very unusual hero and his equally unlikely sidekicks. Bujold piles disaster and indignity on her hero, which the reader can only endure because you're confident that it's all going to work out by the end of the book, which it always does. Indeed, part of the charm of the stories is seeing how the author lures you into believing one absurdity after another. And yet, she sneaks some pretty profound moral issues in between the pages. The point is, seeing an idea within the context of a story lets us test that idea by relating the events of the story to the things we're familiar with in our own lives, and at the same time, observing these deep issues at the remove of a story, especially if it's set a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. That allows us to drop the defensiveness that we might have and the prejudice that we might have that blinds us from seeing our own lives clearly. The way that we understand the anatomy of a story goes back to Aristotle. The Jesuit scholar Walter Ong, in his classic book, Orality and Literacy, describes how the structure of a story was a product of the shift from oral tradition to a written word, a shift that you could argue was necessary also for the beginning of science. He argues that writing restructures consciousness. To quote him, the very reflectiveness of writing, enforced by the slowness of the writing process, we all know that one, as compared to oral delivery, as well as the isolation of the writer, as compared to the oral performer, those encourage the growth of consciousness out of the unconscious. In other words, writing it down forces you to think, which is one reason why, even after you've presented a scientific paper, you still got to write the paper. If nothing else, it forces you to confront and express the assumptions that you've made. One of the classic structures is the Freytag's pyramid. There is an exposition, there is a period of rising action, there's a climax, there's a falling action, there's a denouement, dates from the 19th century. And according to this, a story starts with an exposition, a setting, who are we? Where are we? Who are the protagonists? It starts with a place we care about. It starts with people we care about. Maybe it's the poor orphan with a funny scar living under the stairs at number 4 Privet Drive. Maybe it's the peaceful countryside with the hobbits. And then the story lures you in with a problem, a conflict, a mystery. It makes you want to know what happens next and turn the pages. You want to know what happened to the orphan when the wizard shows up and visits the hobbits. What happened to the orphan when the wizard shows up and tells him about the meaning of his scar? What happens when our hero is dragged away from home? A story has a central point, a climax. The point where the main character makes a crucial decision, when someone uncovers the key piece of information and everything that you thought you knew before has changed. And that decision, that information, that has consequences. It matters. Now, it matters within the story because we know the setup. We know about how the orphan had parents killed by the evil wizard. We know about the evil ring that corrupts the soul. But it also matters to me, the reader. It has a meaning in my own personal universe. It matters in a different way, but at least it matters enough that I want to keep turning the pages. And then we come to the ending, the resolution, the denouement. There we go. One ending too fast. it comes to the end, the resolution. For the story to satisfy, you have to have a moment at the end to step back, catch your breath, and just take in the scenery. Look over the landscape now, where Middle Earth will never be the same, where a new generation boards the train to Hogwarts. I mean, the classic was the movie The Third Man, if you've ever seen that, where he just keeps the camera running for about a minute, and you're just sort of gobsmacked. Or likewise, the ending of the movie The Graduate, where again, he keeps the camera running for about a couple of minutes, and you're wondering, okay, what's really going to happen to those characters? Now, if you're going to write a scientific paper, you need the same parts. You have to describe the problem, you have to describe why it's a problem, why you needed that very clever idea that you came up with, or that very special thing that only you did to make it all work. You have to describe your brilliant contribution. You have to describe what came of it. And then you sit back, you see how it changes all of our ideas about the origin and evolution of the solar system, and while you're going to be asking for a grant to keep the work going for the next 2 years. It turns out that much the same skills apply to working in the activity of writing fiction, the activity of doing science, the activity of living a faith. Teresa Nielsen Hayden is a friend of mine. She's an editor at Tor Science Fiction Books. Recently on her blog, she posted this, what she calls a 4-item formula for writing fiction, because she deals with, fiction writer wannabes all the time. And part of her job is to nurture them so that they can write good enough stories that she can publish them. Her 4 points are this. Number 1, move and keep moving. Number 2, make it consequential. Number 3, recycle your characters. Number 4, see if you already have one. All right, move and keep moving. Tell the story you want to tell without shilly-shallying around. You may know something really wonderful is going to come up in chapter 3, but your reader doesn't know that. You've got to let them know that there's something really cool coming up in chapter 3, and then you'd better deliver on the promise and actually have something cool come up in chapter 3. You can't move and keep moving until there's some place you want to move to. So you need to have an idea of where you want to go before you start writing. You don't write a story without having something that inspired you to write the story in the first place. I'm reminded of the character in the Beatles song, Paperback Writer. He wants to be a paperback writer. He doesn't have any story. He just wants to be a writer. Not good enough. The inspiration can come from anything. It can be a plot idea. It could be a character, sometimes just a setting. The famous story of how C.S. Lewis wrote the Narnia books is he remembered having this scene in his head. And he then said, all right, how can I write a story where you have a faun in the wintertime carrying packages? Make it consequential. What we mean by that is to have the later events be caused or motivated or shaped by the earlier ones so that each event has a consequence to the next event. Each causal or consequential link that you can build into the story is Teresa has this phrase, she says, it's like a steel cable holding your narrative together, or like the string that holds the rosary beads together. Recycle your characters. When you're peopling later events, give preference to the characters you've already introduced. See if you have one. Whenever you need something new, a prop point, a plot thread, a setting, even a minor character, go back through the parts you've already written and see whether you can already find it there. It's surprising how often the exact thing you need is already sitting there in plain sight. Okay, that's about writing a story. What about science? What's the scientific equivalent of move and keep moving? It is know what you're trying to do. Have a clear idea of the specific bit of information you want to get across and concentrating on getting it across, which of course is obvious, but how else would you do science? Lots of ways. A lot of people do it the wrong way. I've done it the wrong way. One example of the wrong way is to make a measurement that's easy to make rather than one that actually tells you what you want to know. You can get flashy results. Oh boy, look at the hair stand out. But it doesn't actually tell you anything. Here's a more specific example from my own field. I'm interested in how meteorites break up as they enter the Earth's atmosphere. So to know that, I have to know how strong is a meteorite. And this plot is typical strength behavior of any material, and that's where the meteorite breaks up. So I could take a meteorite in my lab and increase the strain, or increase the stress and see what the strain is, and find the point where it fractures. Of course, that means taking the meteorite and breaking it. And that's tough to do because most meteorite curators don't want to loan you a rock and then get back a pile of dirt. So instead, what a lot of people do, what I've done, is you measure this thing, the stress versus strain relationship, which gives you the Young's modulus, which is a wonderful number, and you can publish the number. The only trouble is it doesn't actually tell you anything. At best, you can hope that maybe I'll find something interesting that has nothing to do with the original problem. But it's shilly-shallying. Consequential. Make it consequential. Consequential means that the events matter in a bigger sense. When I'm reading a story, when I'm reading a scientific paper, there has to be a reason why each piece occurred from the previous piece. But there also has to be a reason why I care enough to turn the page. One of the worst scientific presentations I ever attended wasn't one I gave, thankfully. It was actually given by a scientist who I admire greatly. But this was back when I was a grad student in the 70s. And he was observing Neptune. Now, in those days, we didn't have the Hubble telescope. We didn't have spacecraft that had been to Neptune. Neptune is a blob of light with a little blob of light next to it. And he was making some obscure measurement. And he was droning on for 45 minutes about this. And then he said, "Are there any questions?" And some smart aleck in the back of the room, not me, raises his hand. And he goes, "Yes, Professor. So what?" I mean, why should I care? A really nasty, rude question, but spot on. There actually probably was a reason why he was doing these measurements, but he forgot to tell us. He forgot to give us the setting. He forgot to describe the conflict. He just gave us the climax without knowing why we should care about that climax. Now, sometimes consequential gets misunderstood. There's a problem with fantasy writers, including good ones. I mean, the Diane Duane young adult novels are great fun, except she has this problem in the first of her series, So You Want to Be a Wizard, where her young heroes save the universe in the first book. What are they going to do in book 2? It shouldn't be that you only write papers that claim to solve every problem in the solar system. It's enough to solve one problem in the solar system. Meanwhile, rules 3 and 4. Recycle your characters. See if you already have one. In science, it means keep it simple. We call it Occam's razor, Bertrand Russell's formulation of Occam's razor. Whenever possible, substitute constructions out of known entities for inferences to unknown entities. See if you already have one. You know? None of these deus ex machinas. That's our life of science. How do we apply it to lives of faith? Number 1, move and keep moving. Don't shilly-shally. Start talking to God now. Don't wait until Sunday. Don't wait until you're in a quiet place. Don't wait for the end of this talk. Now. And remember, the decision to get in touch with God, however you do it, is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of the story. It's not even the climax of the story. It's the beginning of the story. It's the opening page. Once you do that, then you look for developments, you watch for conflict. It will come. There's no story without conflict. Watch for the tough choices that come along. It's surprising how many people sleepwalk through the climax of their own story without ever noticing it happened. Watch for the consequences of those choices. You can't skip ahead to the last chapter to find how it's going to turn out. You have to trust the authors. And then you discover that what you've done is just the first novel of a good long series of novels. And like the Wild Cards books, it's a shared universe. George R.R. Martin basically got together with lots of other science fiction writers who each write a story in this giant universe. That's the universe that we're living in. It's a shared universe where my story interacts with his story, which interacts with her story, and we all wind up having to deal with the fact that there's more than just me writing the story. Number 2, be consequential. Suddenly a miracle occurs, as in step 3 here. It's not only bad science and lousy storytelling, it's also lousy religion. It's not the miracle I doubt, it's the suddenly. Yeah, things do happen in your life by chance, by surprise, divine coincidence, if you will. But how you respond to them is not by chance. And how God responds to how you respond is not by chance. There is an internal logic to what's going on between you and God. Sometimes you have to accept it even when you can't see it. On the other hand, if it does turn out to be just random junk, maybe it's not from God. You know, I think one of the most original things that Ignatius of Loyola did in the spiritual exercises, which is the foundation of Jesuit spirituality, and I hope everybody in this room is familiar with some aspect of it. One of the most fundamental things he did was what he calls the discernment of spirits. Rather than trying to reproduce that here, I'll just point out that he came up with the fact that you need to be able to tell what urges are coming from God and what urges may look like they're coming from God but actually aren't. It's tricky because not every outside urge is an urge from God, but an urge from God you can tell in part because it has an internal logic that you can learn to recognize. They're not just random miracles that occur suddenly. To put it another way, if it's bad storytelling, it's probably bad spirituality. Number 3, recycle your characters. The path to God is through your neighbors, the people you know, the people who are already there. Number 4, see if you already have one. For us Catholics, I think this means recognizing and using the richness that already exists in our religious tradition. God doesn't just appear suddenly out of nowhere. In fact, he's there all the time on stage. You just need a little bit of practice to be able to recognize him. If nothing else, you can recognize him by his weird sense of humor, I think. But again, I remind you, if it's good storytelling, it's probably good spirituality. And the fact is, the greatest creation each of us gets to make is our own lives. We start with the materials that are dealt to us, the situation in which we're born, the talents and the limitations that we're born with, and then we have the chance to form and shape those things into something new, something never done before. Our lives are our own personal science fiction novels. Why do I say they're science fiction? Because they take place in the future. Granted, there's only so much we can write in them ourselves. Sometimes the other characters just don't behave the way we want them to or the way we expected them to, but they wouldn't be real characters if we could pull their strings, and that's something that every storyteller knows. More than one writer has described how the characters come alive when they're doing it right and do things they didn't expect. In one of her journals, the author Madeleine L'Engle describes what was happening when she was writing this book, The Arm of the Starfish. She writes, "I had the story thoroughly plotted, and there was nobody named Joshua Archer in it. Nevertheless, when the hero, Adam Headington, wakes up in the Ritz Hotel in Lisbon, there's a young man sitting in his room, a young man named Joshua Archer. And Joshua was as much a surprise to me as he was to Adam. And he changed the plot radically. He made me rewrite half the book. Actually, he turns out to be the central character of the book. Not the point of view character, but the one that everything else revolves around." That's a sign of good writing, and that's a sign of how reality works with us. And of course, it's also true in science. The universe doesn't always behave the way we expect it. When that happens, it's called opportunity. The science fiction writer Isaac Asimov is reported to have said, "The most exciting thing you can hear in a lab is not 'Eureka!' but rather, That's funny. The art, and it is an art, based on a hunch, closely related to a feeling. The art is knowing when to attack the funniness by assuming there's a flaw in your setup and I've got to clean it up, or when to admit then you actually have found something real and new. You know, in my own field of astronomy, there are a couple of cases where people thought they had discovered something new and they found out instead that there was a case about 5 years ago of faster-than-light neutrinos that turned out to be the wrong kind of wire connecting two instruments together. There are other times, the classic example, a bunch of guys working at the Bell Labs back in the 1920s got weird results. And the one fellow who said, I can't figure this out, I'm going on vacation, went to a vacation in England, saw that there was a talk on something kind of interesting at Oxford, and heard the guy at Oxford using his results to prove that the neutrino has a wavelength. It wasn't an artifact. This is how treating religion and science as a story can help. We've all read enough stories to know instinctively when the story gets it, when it gets it right, when it gets it wrong. Those same instincts are going to be useful to help you to figure out whether to believe a particular scientific explanation or to say, don't think so, go back and check your wires. Hearing a story lets us ask if we believe in it long enough to spend the time to look for the data that's going to prove it or disprove it. It's no accident that the Gospels, the heart of Christian scripture, are stories and not theological discourses. You can hear a story, you can evaluate it against your own human experience of life, and by this instinct, draw a lesson from it. Of course, it's not always the lesson that the writer intended. There's a famous story of the convert who was hearing the story of the prodigal son for the first time. The prodigal son finally says, I can go back to my father, abandons the pigs that he's been taking care of, and the convert goes, wait a minute. If he goes back to his father, who's taking care of the pigs? Okay. That said, let me illustrate this idea with my own story. My work for the last 40 years has been in meteoritics, rocks that fall out of the sky. And we know for a lot of reasons that they're not from Earth, that they actually have fallen from space. And about 5% of them are actually lumps of basalt. They're like frozen lavas, like basalts out here on Earth. And that's interesting because we know how basalts behave in terrestrial rocks. We can see where they're formed. In theory, we should be able to use that knowledge to say something about how these basalts were formed in outer space. Now, back in the 1970s, when I first got started in this field, I was at MIT. And there was a young professor at MIT named John Lewis who had this grand model for the origin of the solar system. The theory was called the equilibrium condensation theory. That was a picture of him. I loaned my notebook to a friend to take notes, and they came back with the cartoons of John Lewis and the little Martian saying, think again, foolish Earthman. But John Lewis had this idea of how you could use the chemistry of the cloud of gas and dust that made our sun and predict what should be the chemical things in equilibrium that would form the inner planets compared to the outer planets, that would form the clouds of Jupiter, that would form the icy moons of the outer solar system, that would explain the chemistry we see in the meteorites and asteroids. Pretty cool theory. At the same time, a colleague of John Lewis's at MIT, a guy named Tom McCord, was using the telescope as a giant pair of binoculars to look at those asteroids. And he would measure the spectrum by shining the light from an asteroid through a series of different filters and then collect the light on a photo tube, which was hot stuff back in 1973. Think of it as a 1-pixel camera. And by this measurement, he could measure the exact colors and which colors were stronger and which colors were weaker, and compare that against the reflectance spectra of known minerals. In fact, he had a graduate student, Mike Gaffey, who took the spectra of meteorites. That's the guy there, that's the instrument that Tom McCord used, which I used as an undergraduate, and Greg Ruffa there is the guy who drew the cartoons in my notebook. Mike Gaffey over there worked out that there was a kind of spectra characteristic of basaltic meteorites that exactly matched the reflectance spectra of Vesta. Not only that, but Vesta, the brightest of the asteroids, was the only asteroid that matched the basaltic meteorites. Meanwhile, at the University of Arizona, there's another young grad student, guy from Britain named Mike Drake. That's what he looked like back then. And he was doing a doctoral thesis on how you could mathematically calculate how trace elements behave when lavas are formed. On the other side of the country, at Harvard, there was an undergraduate there, Ed Stolper, who was working out the chemistry of the basaltic meteorites and trying to show what different collection of minerals would melt to give you the basaltic meteorites. Mike Drake wound up being the chair of the department and one of the huge members in the planetary science field. He was the chair of the department at Arizona for many years. Sadly died a few years ago. Ed Stolper wound up being provost of Caltech. So, these are all the different pieces going on. Now, it's 1971. I've arrived to read science fiction at MIT. And I was a student of John Lewis. I did my master's thesis there in '75. During that time, I took a course in observational astronomy from Tom McCord, and the TA of the course was Mike Gaffey. So these are all people I knew. And then in '75, I show up with this gang of people at Arizona. Yeah, that's me with all the hair there. Do you see the resemblance? Yeah. And who was I doing my thesis under was Mike Drake. So Mike Drake teaches me how to do these models. I was working on a desktop computer, a 1975 vintage desktop computer. You can only imagine how powerful it was. Our interest at the time was to build a mathematical model that could predict how the basalts on the moon, the Apollo 17 basalts, behaved. And we came up with an answer which was not too bad. And then Mike says, well, it works. Why not see how the basaltic meteorites evolved? Let's do the same thing. So, just to give you a background, all the different pieces you have to do to make this model work. You got to know a general framework for how the meteorites were formed. We used Ed Stolper's work. You needed to know the partition coefficients of the rare elements. That was Mike Drake's work. You needed to actually have values for those trace elements that were in the meteorites we're trying to measure. And you go to the literature for that, you know? Remember, recycle your characters. Use stuff that's already out there. In addition, you had to guess the starting composition. You had to guess the starting trace element abundance. You had to know the amount of melting. Those three things. If you know two, you can calculate the third. Now, typically what you do then, you've got all these different pieces, and you've got a little number, you plug in the numbers, you turn the crank, you shift one of the numbers, you turn the crank, and after a while you have a whole suite of, if this is the beginning, that's the end. If this is the beginning, that's the end. If you're lucky, maybe you can rule out some beginnings, but you're going to have an infinite number of possible beginnings. But that's not the way I did it. Because I was raised in John Lewis's theory that he already thought he knew what the composition of the asteroids was. So I just said, let's assume that he's right. Let's assume that Ed's right. Let's assume that that's how things formed. Can I use that starting composition? And by golly, you can. And you can match the meteorites, shown there at a scale of centimeters, with Vesta, shown there at a scale of kilometers. You can match it if you had a starting composition, just like solar composition, that was 10% melted. Now, that was pretty cool. So, what do? You showed that these models are all consistent with what we see. You go to a meeting. We went to the Meteoritical Society meeting. We present the paper, except just before I'm up to get my little paper, there's another group who have done the same thing. Only what they present is, well, if you tweak this, you get this. You tweak this, you get this. You tweak this, you get... They didn't tell it in the form of a story. They just had a whole suite of... And I get up and I tell my story. Once upon a time, there was a solar nebula. And the nebula melts, and it gets these meteorites. Much more memorable. Everybody's forgotten that other paper. I get the credit for it. This is cool. But... afterwards, the guy there with the all will be revealed t-shirt, Jerry Wasserberg, he used to be, in World War II, he was a drill sergeant. And he still acted like a drill sergeant. Because he would drill you good if you didn't get your data right. And he comes up to me after the meeting. He's a Caltech professor. I'm a first-year grad student. And he goes, "That was very interesting, Guy, but do you actually believe it?" Which is a nasty question and a very appropriate one. And I go, "Well, actually, I think I do, because, you know, this piece fits and that piece fits and all these different piece fitses." And he goes, "But wait a minute. If the meteorites we see represent only 10%, melting of 10%, what happened to the other 90%? How come we don't see those meteorites?" And I go, "Well, that's easy, because they come from Vesta. You're only seeing the stuff chipped off the surface." Really obvious. Actually, no, it's not obvious. We had shown not just that we could explain how something like Vesta could make these meteorites. We had shown that they actually had to come from Vesta itself, because any other body that would have made them would have been broken up and we'd seen the other 90%. And that meant that we've got in Vesta a fragment of the early solar system that has never been broken up. And that means that if you come up with any theory for how the planets are formed and run into each other and break and reaccrete, you have to account for the fact that there's one that didn't break up. And for 40 years, this has been a keystone, this has been a key point in our understanding of the evolution of the solar system. It's so important that in 2007, NASA launched a spacecraft that went in orbit around Vesta to collect all the data to confirm this theory. You know, we had worked out this simple syllogism. All basaltic meteorites come from an asteroid parent body that's still intact, that looks like basaltic meteorites. Vesta is intact. Vesta looks like basaltic meteorites, and it's the only one. Therefore, they all come from Vesta. Pretty darn good. Except somebody has the temerity to say it's all wrong. The data from the Dawn team show that that picture doesn't work, that one of our assumptions is wrong. That's funny. Fortunately, the person who made that shot down my 40 years worth of work was me. So much better to find your own mistake than somebody else finding it. But there's an important lesson. To go back to quote The Lord of the Rings, don't adventures ever end? They don't. Stories are always incomplete. Our science is always incomplete. But there's a more fundamental difference between story and reality. Reality is what happened. Story is how we tell it. One of the differences between story and real life, which you learn when you try to write stories, is that writing a story, following these rules, being careful to not introduce new characters or gods popping out of the woodwork, it's all artificial. It's not reality. Real life is always messier. Real life is not the controlled environment we create in a lab. It's, the scientific paper is kind of like one of those after-school specials. It's based on a true story. It really isn't the truth. This is a quote from one of my friends. I don't know how many people here are science fiction fans and recognize Robert Heinlein, one of the greats of the... every kid grows up reading Robert Heinlein and thinking, wow, that's great, until, as he says, one of the important steps in a young science fiction fan's journey to maturity is realizing that Heinlein's ability to sound as if he knew what he was talking about was much greater than his ability to actually know what he was talking about. That's the difference between artifice and reality. One of the reasons I trust the Gospels, one of the reasons I trust that the Gospels are telling me the truth, that they're telling me things that actually happen in the life of Jesus. I'm not talking about the parables, obviously, but the historical parts, is that there's way too much messiness and inconsistency in them. No well-crafted bit of fiction would read like the Gospels read. I think that's what the early theologian Tertullian meant when he wrote, "It is certain because it is impossible." No one trying to write a believable story is going to make up what goes on in the Gospels. Actually, we know how a good writer would write a Messiah story. I've read a bunch of them. None of them read like the Gospels. None of them are as inconsistent and messy as the Gospels, and none of them are as profound. Actually, it's a good exercise to try writing stories yourself. You don't ever have to publish the stories, but you could publish them on a fan fiction site or something. The point is, knowing how stories work by writing one gives you the experience to judge not only what the story is trying to say when you're reading somebody else's story, but also, is the author being honest with you, or is he cheating the way that you had to cheat that make that story work? Now, whether or not the author is cheating is not the same thing as whether or not the story is factual. But it can tell you whether or not the author thinks the story is factual. Sometimes that's a good thing to know. There's a classic writer, very well published, whose books are almost good. Irritates the heck out of me, and I was talking to another fantasy writer about this, and she says the trouble is when you read his books, you get the impression he doesn't actually believe in the fantasy. Whereas, though, in the rest of her life, she's a staunch materialist atheist, I don't believe in that kind of stuff, she writes these fantasies which are phenomenally spiritual because she believes in them, at least while she's writing them. I suspect she believes in them, really, just won't admit it yet. But the point is that every physics student knows the phrase suddenly intuitively obvious to the casual observer. We depend on that kind of intuition. Most of the descriptions of science don't give enough credit to the emotional side of it. We are not divided into Kirks and Spocks. And in fact, neither Kirk nor Spock were really all emotion or all intellect. Well, one of them was very, very clever. The other was a mass of emotions. Both of them tried to hide it for reasons that made good stories. But it's in our emotions that we find not only how we do it, where we get the instincts to know what experiment to do next, but the deeper question that I promised at the beginning: why do we do it? Why do I get passionate about science fiction books? Even the ones I can see aren't great literature, but I can't stop myself from picking up the next volume. Why do I keep showing up in the lab day after day, or staying outside in a cold night to look through a telescope? What am I really looking for? Why do I keep putting up with all of the frustrations that I've had to deal with as a planetary scientist at the Vatican Observatory for 20 years, dealing with a large, clumsy, top-heavy, badly run, over-centralized bureaucracy that's utterly insensitive to what's really going on away from headquarters? Why do I put up with it? Because at the end of the day, only NASA was able to get us to the moon. Why do you laugh? You think I was talking of some other bureaucracy? But then the deeper question is, why did we want to go to the moon? There is a philosophical school of thought that says human beings only do things for pleasure, but obviously that's not quite right. If anything, we do things for the hope or the expectation that we'll get some sort of pleasure out of it eventually. You have to open the book and start reading before you can enjoy it. And, most of our expectations are never met. Some of them won't last forever. That's why we keep opening new books. But I think St. Augustine had it right 1,700 years ago when he wrote, "You have made us for yourself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." All of our desires, the desire to be in the world of that novel, the desire to be in the world of science, ultimately are a desire for God. We write in order to imitate the Creator, who is the author of everything. We read other people's creations in order to imitate the God who I believe enjoys the creations we're making of our own lives. We do science because of the exquisite joy we get in feeling close up the breath of the Creator who made this universe, and in following with delight the clever story he's woven into the way he created it. That's the final and ultimate point of unity between science and fiction and religion. They're all enjoyed by the same human being who ultimately is looking for the same rest in the arms of the same Creator. That's why this world matters. And yet, we know that what we see in this world is but a faint shadow of the world to come. Like a good book, there's truth to be found here, but like a book, at the end of the day, it's only a thin tissue of words pointing towards something, hinting at something that cannot be captured but only suggested. Any book, true as it might be, is not the reality itself. The scientific papers, profound as they might be, is not the same thing as the universe they're trying to describe. Our religion can only lead us to God. Our religion is not the same thing as God. I'm reminded of the old Jewish folktale with the title that says it all, Loving the Torah More Than God, which is a danger in any religion. Meanwhile, what we do have at hand is the product of our own creativity, the product of our own God-given talents. It contains and expresses true knowledge. That's why we call it science. But it's also something that we've invented for ourselves, which is why you can call it fiction. Story, in my case, science fiction, has changed my life. It inspired me to an education and then a career in doing science. It showed me that being a scientist could be a great adventure. It also showed me the romance of being Catholic. Good and evil, portrayed in an honest fantasy, can be identified with the good and evil that I face in my own life. Choosing good and fighting evil is exactly the struggle that makes characters into heroes. And meanwhile, seeing worlds that might be teaches me to be more aware of the worlds that actually are. Science fiction led me to science. In fantasy, I found truth. In both, I have discovered things that I would never have seen without them. And I'm always reminded how wonderful it is to keep turning the pages. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Brother Guy, for that amazing opening keynote address for this Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination. We have two respondents to Brother Guy's talk, if they would come forward and sit at the table. I'm looking at the clock at the left, and we've only been at it for 5 minutes, so I think we've got a little bit more time to go over there. It says 4:10, so I'm thinking that we're looking pretty good. Our two respondents today are from our own faculty. I'll call Dean Crabtree a member of our faculty. Tom Ward, our first respondent, is an assistant professor of philosophy, and he's one of the inaugural cohort of Academy Fellows who have been given release time to work on scholarly projects that are in connection to and in dialogue with and working through the Catholic intellectual tradition. After getting an MPhil at Oxford, he got his PhD in philosophy at UCLA. He's a well-liked and well-respected and excellent teacher. His favorite class, I think, is his first-year seminar called Imaginative Rationality, Philosophical Themes in C.S. Lewis, J.R. Tolkien, and their intellectual circle. So something that would be near and dear to the heart of Brother Guy as well. So Tom will respond first, and after Tom, we have Dean Robbin Crabtree, who came to LMU just this fall and has already taken the campus by storm. She was selected after an extensive national search to be the dean of our Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts. She earned her PhD and MA degrees in speech communications from the University of Minnesota after receiving a BA degree from UCSB. In fact, she's happy to be back here because her mother lives here, and she has roots, deep roots in California.
And the weather.
and the weather. She used to be the dean at Fairfield University in Connecticut, and they're under about 60 inches of snow still, so we're lucky to be here. As an accomplished scholar and teacher, Dean Crabtree is widely published in gender studies, intercultural communication, and international service learning. She's a graduate of the first cohort of the Ignatian Colleagues Program, which is a national program sponsored by all the Jesuit colleges and universities that takes leadership from the universities and engages with them about the Ignatian vision and the Catholic intellectual tradition and Jesuit pedagogy. So she's a member of the first cohort of that. She also was a successful dean at Fairfield University and a faculty member at New Mexico State and DePauw University. As I said, she's taken our campus by storm. She's jumped in feet first to take leadership on several key initiatives, including curriculum transformation, program renewal, and shared governance. She's a tireless worker and has been a key friend to the Academy as it gets started. So we're happy to have both Tom and Robbin to share with us their reflections about the art of storytelling. Thank you.
Okay. So religion, science, and the art of storytelling. What do these three apparently distinct things have to do with each other? Brother Guy has spoken movingly about their similarity. When we attend to what's involved in doing good science, writing a good story, and living a religious life, we find that the basic components of each have a certain correspondence. And at bottom, he tells us, echoing St. Augustine, stories, science, and religion are all directing us to one and the same end, that still point of rest in the knowledge and love of God. The secret, perhaps subconscious, prayer of the scientist and storyteller, no less than the religious believer, is the prayer of the psalmist. My soul thirsts for God, for the living God. When shall I come and appear before God? And this has been the not-so-secret prayer of many of the great thinkers who have shaped our Catholic intellectual tradition. St. Thomas Aquinas speculated that in the beatific vision, which is the supreme joy of the saints, we understand God and understand other things through God. God is the best astronomer, the best philosopher, the best storyteller. Whatever your discipline, God knows all about it. Aquinas himself knew Aristotle and Augustine very well, but he knew that God knew them even better. So Aquinas' heaven really is a scholar's paradise. In that blessed vision, we will finally understand the mysteries that motivate our intellectual quests. Here below, we struggle on, trying to make sense in our own disciplines and trying to make sense out of our own lives. Our worldly position is the position of the ancient wanderer seeking the oracle at the cave of the Sibyl. There is the oracle written on oak leaves. Now a wind blows, and the leaves are scattered. And here we are, seeking the leaves and seeking their proper order. Some of us find a leaf or two. Across a whole university, pooling our resources, we might scrounge together enough leaves to make a little book. But how shall we order them? The modern university, Catholic or otherwise, is very good at finding the odd leaf here and there, but finding leaves is not the whole story. To put our little oracles together, to produce a book of the world, which gives us a coherent account of the unity of knowledge across the disciplines, and which gives us the whole truth about ourselves, that is a much harder task, a task which many universities now simply refuse to undertake. In the last canto of Dante's Paradiso, the poet has made it to the end of his journey and enjoys a glimpse of God. And in that vision, he saw the Sibyl's leaves, no longer scattered throughout the universe, but instead, as he puts it, bound together by love in a single book. Well, LMU is not paradise. But thy will be done on earth, however imperfectly as it is in heaven. As a university, rather than a mere assortment of departments, we have a duty to show our students not just a leaf here or there, but a way to put them together. Our recognition of this duty is reflected in our mission. Aristotle thought that all of us, by nature, desire knowledge, but for many of our students, other desires compete for attention. One way to encourage learning is by appealing to extrinsic goods, such as the honors and riches awaiting those who get good grades. But we can also encourage learning by fanning the flame of that natural desire for knowledge, so that knowledge is pursued as an intrinsic good and not merely instrumentally. How sad and dull it is to talk to students who care only for the extrinsic goods of their educations. As teachers, we want to teach in a way that helps students to care deep down about the subjects we teach them, to form them to be co-inquirers with us. We educate the whole person by offering a liberal arts education which requires students to study a wide range of subjects. We offer training of the intellect as well as the imagination, and training not just in how students ought to think, but how they ought to live. Institutionally, we are committed to the unpopular proposition that there are facts about goodness and morality, just as there are facts about science and technology. Education of the whole person can be assessed in part by our students' commitment to promoting justice, justice in their own souls, in their personal relationships, and in their various political communities. The promotion of justice at its best signifies that some of those scattered leaves have been brought together in the right order, an order consisting of facts about how things are, facts about how things ought to be, facts about how I can and should work to align that which is with that which ought to be, bound together by a love which seeks to make it on earth as it is in heaven. And that talk of heaven brings me to that part of our mission which is most relevant to this new academy. It is part of the faith that the world as a whole is a great story with adventures and dangers and treacheries and redemption, along with a supremely happy ending. Often the world does not feel this way. Too often we feel like Pascal, who said this: "When I consider the short duration of my life, swallowed up in an eternity before and after, the little space I fill engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces whereof I know nothing, and which know nothing of me, I am terrified. The eternal silences of those infinite spaces frightens me." But Pascal knew better, or at least believed better. Serving faith means, in part, holding on to and proclaiming that wholesome and ennobling belief that there is not eternal silence in those infinite spaces, but a still, small voice inviting us to read and participate in its great story. My thanks to Brother Guy, who has looked into those infinite spaces and brings us tidings of the story, not the silence.
The short person. So I wanted to thank 𝙎𝙬𝙨 for inviting me to participate in the conversation today, and to Brother Guy for his evocative remarks. I know we'll be reflecting on his remarks in myriad ways as we launch the Academy, as we have gatherings where scholars from different disciplines attempt to have a common conversation that links disciplinary concepts, the theories and methods of diverse fields of study with a common search for commonality, for common good, for a common story. It's helped me think about my own research story and and I've been weaving some thoughts into the remarks that I prepared. Tom has helped us think about the parables and the stories that we seek to make sense of our own lives. And I think this is something that if you read other of Brother Guy's materials or hear his talks, you'll see this as a theme throughout. LMU is heaven, by the way, but that's a that's a newcomer's perspective. As Brother Guy's talk tonight illustrates, and he's written and spoken about elsewhere, most of the stories we tell are essentially autobiographical. So my reflections might unfold as a set of fragmented autobiographical snapshots of an unlikely journey through which I have become one who tells stories about Catholic and Jesuit higher education, about the Catholic intellectual tradition, and about Ignatian spirituality and pedagogy. Unlikely in large part because of the backstory, which is I'm a secular Jew raised by non-believing but religiously observant extended family who were socialists, activists, and deeply cultural Jews. Here's something of the road that brought me to Jesuit higher education. As a student activist in college, my work with the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador in the early 1980s was the beginning of contact with the Jesuits. Throughout the 1980s, studying clandestine radio in El Salvador and community radio in Nicaragua while in graduate school, I learned more about Jesuit history in the region and their solidarity with those justice movements. And all of this time, I was in public universities. During the 1990s, as part of a service delegation from the Liberal Arts College, where I was then a junior faculty member, I again crossed paths with the Jesuit story, visiting the massacre site at El Mazote, engaging with base Christian communities, practicing liberation theology, and visiting the site of the Jesuit priests' murders at the UCA in San Salvador. On that project, we worked side by side with the people of Consolmagno, which I find quite interesting now, that that's the name of the town, a tiny community in the Cuscatlán province at the base of the Guasapa volcano in the ex-conflictive zone immediately following the signing of the peace accords. And I continued to be involved with projects like that one in Central America, in Kenya, and in other places in the United States throughout the 1990s. These projects, which arose from my own work in development communication, gave me a feeling of oneness, and a feeling of awe, a feeling of joy. I coined a term, theoretical epiphany, which is when you are very idealistic as an activist and you study theory very much in the abstract, and then you encounter it on the ground with real people in a shared moment, and it becomes real to you, not merely theoretical, but real. And the personal and the political, it is also a feminist modality, the personal and the political become a lived experience connected to the intellectual. It's quite an amazing feeling. It's a flow. And these are words that I hear people talk about when they talk about God. For me, this was a narrative shift, to use Brother Guy's term. These experiences brought me to a research focus on intercultural contact in international service learning involving participatory community development projects. These were three streams of thought in research that had never talked to each other, really. Just as I was getting a reputation for work in this emerging field, I also moved from a state university to a Jesuit university mid-career. And it was the mission of Jesuit education that caused me to leave tenure and seek a position at a Jesuit university. And two interesting things came from this shift. The first is that I experienced a move from the margins to the center. That is, teaching and doing research that was novel and marginal at that time in my discipline, and tolerated, though not well understood at my state university, became value added at my new Jesuit university. not only was the kind of community-based social justice teaching and research that I did, not only was it valued, but it was considered central to mission, and this was a new feeling. Through my participation, the second piece is through my participation in Catholic workshops on Catholic social teaching, the Catholic intellectual tradition, and Ignatian spirituality while I was at Fairfield University, I suppose I had something of a conversion, but don't get nervous. That is, streams of Catholic thought and related principles of Ignatian spirituality gave me new insights into my own work. A few years after joining the faculty at Fairfield and increasingly steeped in Catholic thought, I had an experience, and I'll try and tell it as a good story. I was on a project visit in a small community called Santa Rosa in Minas Rosita in the central area of the mining region of Nicaragua. To travel there, we took a long, the flight to Miami and then the flight to Nicaragua on the large airlines. And then it was a small 6-seater into the interior. And then it was an hour-long bump in the back of a pickup truck on Nicaraguan roads further into the interior. And then we got into a canoe and we forged a river. And then we hiked up a muddy gully and then finally to the top of the mountain and through. I almost lost a shoe in the mud, but we got it. And there we were in Santa Rosa. Surveying the project that we were going to do there, I was as obsessed as always with development theory, with the principles by which this project had been derived. Were they participatory? Was the community involved in deciding on the project? Obsessed as ever with all of the conceptual aspects of my field and of doing and preparing for cross-cultural participatory development and service learning. And as this site visit team had determined, yeah, this is a good project, and I was feeling pretty good about it, but still looking around. A tiny woman comes and puts her arm through mine, and she says, "Thank you for coming today." And I'm walking with her, and I'm thinking, where did she come from? And she says, "No functionary, ni nacional, ni provincial, ni municipal has ever visited this community. Because you came, we now know we exist." That moment was incredible for me and definitely not accounted for in the theory. From her, and I think because I was an educator in a Catholic institution, I was able to understand the simple yet vital role of witness and accompaniment, terminology that I had probably never used before that time. This is the point at which the story changed, after which everything was different, a new epiphany. My experience in Santa Rosa, as reflected in my scholarly writing since that time, illustrates the mission of our Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination at LMU to help scholars from all fields and faculty from all backgrounds learn about and engage with the Catholic intellectual tradition in their own scholarship. La Abuelita de Santa Rosa changed the plot. This little woman changed the plot. Our research journeys, I recalled today when Brother Guy was talking, and my advisor told me this when I came back from my fieldwork in Nicaragua. Our research journeys are also our personal journeys. So despite my best intentions to continue teaching and doing research in my field, I was tapped for leadership. And it may seem obvious now that a department chair who became a center director would also become a dean. Discerning a path to administration is not simple or easy for a teacher-scholar activist like myself, and I resisted it in as many ways as I could. But on one of my annual gatherings with my closest girlfriends, also all teacher scholars, I was confronted. And this is the story that I call Administration as Spiritual Gift. Amy was talking about some spiritual exploration she was doing and working with a spiritual guide. Catherine was talking about her latest art project. In addition to her scholarship, she's a ceramicist, a cabinet maker, she paints, she's incredible. Sheena was talking about her experiments with Eastern medicine, learning to Bollywood dance, and forays into creative writing, all as part of her path to achieve what turned out to be quite a miraculous recovery from ovarian cancer. Hearing of their talents and reflecting on my dull life as a newly selected dean, spending my time seeking bureaucratic reform, I lamented out loud, "Oh, I wish I had spiritual or artistic gifts like you guys have." And Amy responded without missing a beat, "Maybe administration is your spiritual gift." And I cried. You've been there. You've been there. Now, as I live my vocation as an academic administrator, and through my engagement with the Ignatian Colleagues Program, I've learned to embrace these gifts. Indeed, I've found a surprising affinity with the story of St. Ignatius of Loyola. His spiritual awakening and his call to vocation ultimately resulted in him living his life as an administrator, not out in the field, but in the office, creating the conditions for the work done by others and supporting those who do it. The discernment of spirits, notions such as attention, reverence, and devotion apply surprisingly well in administrative work, in which the cycles of consolation and desolation, or I should say desolation and consolation, ebb and flow. And it turns out storytelling is essential to this vocation. As dean, you tell stories to prospective students, to parents, alumni, donors, and friends of the university. As dean, you help students learn to tell their stories, particularly in relation to accountability for mistakes, stories of intellectual, moral, and civic development. To build stories. As dean, you help faculty tell stories about their achievements in pre-tenure reviews and rank and tenure applications, and to understand the importance of the stories they tell about their development as effective teachers and their scholarly trajectories. These have to be good evidence-based stories, evidence-based arguments connected to mission. And I continue to tell my own story, one of unlikely emergence into leadership in Jesuit education, because the next chapter of the Ignatian educational story will largely be written by non-Jesuits. In closing, I want to evoke John Hoey's book, Where is Knowing Going?, which invites us to reflect on the Catholic University in relation to the Catholic intellectual and spiritual traditions. Hoey notes that the Catholic intellectual tradition does not belong to the Church or even to Catholics, but to all those who commit to and work for its principles. Hoey emphasizes that the Catholic intellectual tradition in all its dimensions is, quote, nurtured by all those who are committed in both their research and teaching, and I would add, their administrative duties, to competence in their disciplines, right reasoning, objectivity, and the common good. The challenge for all of us then, including those of us who are not Catholic nor even Christian, and yet find ourselves living our vocation in Catholic institutions, is to participate in and facilitate dialogues about what it means to be large C Catholic in name and tradition, as well as small c Catholic in philosophy and practice, and to ensure the dialogue between these and among all of us is authentically Catholic on the one hand and inclusively realized on the other hand. I'm happy to be a companion in this mission, and I look forward to seeing how the Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination at LMU enriches that project for our teacher scholars and for all of us who are here for the next chapter in our own stories.
Well, thank you, Tom and Robbin. And all together with Brother Guy's amazing address, what we have seen is that science, religion, all of this is storytelling. The scholarship, the storytelling we do with our scholarship as teachers, as students, as faculty, seeks the good. The storytelling that we do with our lives seeks the good. And we hope that as we embark on this exciting adventure of the Academy of Catholic Thought and Imagination, that this will really become a reality here at LMU and throughout and beyond the confines of LMU as well. There's a great reception prepared for us. There probably isn't time for questions. In the Jesuit gardens next door, if you go out to the left and go to the left there, there'll be people directing you to the receptions. You'll have plenty of opportunities to question and to talk with Brother Guy at the reception or our respondents. Thank you again for coming, and let's once again thank Brother Guy.